You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Always, it's great to be back behind the Golden Dixie Heritage microphone and to bring you another episode of TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. From week to week, I'm always surprised and pleased to find out who our Dixie Heritage subscribers are. One of our longtime Dixie Heritage subscribers for about the last 3 years has been Lieutenant Colonel Edward Kennedy. And Lieutenant Colonel Kennedy has had a military career spanning over 4 decades. He has, for the last several years, been a professor of military history at the Army Staff College in Leavenworth, Kansas. Unfortunately, he was recently basically forced to resign, or to retire rather. Essentially, he was left jobless. And the reason for that, essentially he was fired, as he tells it. He will tell you that calling it a forced retirement is really a euphemism. He said, at the end of the day, I'm out of a job. And he's right. And the reason why the Army wanted him out was because he was politically incorrect. You say, well, what made him politically incorrect? He was a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. He had Confederate ancestors. He dared to postulate in a military history class that there was more to the causes of the war between the states than just slavery. Not only that, he got in trouble for some other things that you would think he wouldn't have even gotten in trouble for all. For example, the first general officer to be killed in the European theater during World War II was Brigadier General Nathan Bedford Forrest III. And so when he was putting up a museum display and his superior officers found out that the person was Nathan Bedford Forrest III, they went ballistic and the political correctness thing came out and all that. Anyways, rather than tell you his story, I'll let him tell you the story. So, straight into our interview with Lieutenant Colonel Edward Kennedy. What was your rank when you left the military?
Lieutenant Colonel.
How did your military career start?
My dad came home from Vietnam. I was 17, and I asked him to sign the papers, enlist me. So I enlisted as an soldier. And then I got into the military academy prep school, which soldiers who don't have good scores can go to, and they can get your scores high enough to get into West Point.
I'm guessing that you served in Vietnam, and then you went to the military academy at West Point, and then you went back into the military as an officer?
All of it's true, except I did not go to Vietnam. My dad came home in the fall of 1970, and of course we were getting out of Vietnam at that time. I enlisted in 71. Vietnam was still going on, of course, but I never went to Vietnam.
So how long did you serve when you went in as an enlisted man before you ended up in the military academy?
A year.
So you served for a year, then you went to West Point, and I'm guessing you were at West Point for 4 years, graduated?
Yes, sir.
And then you went back into the military as a second lieutenant?
I did.
And how many years did you serve that time?
21 years as a commissioned officer.
Okay, wow. And then I'm guessing, and you had achieved the rank of lieutenant colonel then when you retired at the end of the 21 years?
Yes, sir.
And so had you began teaching at the War College during those 21 years, or was that after you had retired?
I taught at the Army Staff College. The War College is the one that's at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. That's for senior officers. I taught at the mid-grade officer Staff College, which is located at Fort Leavenworth. I taught there for 6 years on active duty on 2 different assignments. For the first time, and taught in the tactics department. And then when I found out I wasn't going to go any further in my career, I told them, just send me back there, I'll teach history. And so I went back and taught military history for 3 years and then retired in 97.
So when you found out you weren't going to go any further in your career, how did you find that out? What exactly happened at that point?
Well, there's certain things you have to do to get through certain windows to keep going. And when Desert Storm came, I did not go to Desert Storm. I had already left the unit, and then Desert Storm happened. That unit went to Desert Storm. So I did not go to Desert Storm. All the guys who did not go to Desert Storm, generally, most of them never got promoted further or didn't get what we call career-enhancing jobs. In other words, I didn't get picked up for command. All the guys who went to Desert Storm got picked up. So I knew my career was over. They said, here's what we'll do. We can send you back to Europe. And, of course, this is the time the Army was going through a massive downsizing. And they said, well, we can send you back to Europe. And I said, well, I just came from Europe. I don't want to go back because if I have to get out of the Army, if I'm forced out, which a lot of people were being forced out, I would have a very difficult time finding a job. So I did a deal with them. I said, look, you can send me to Korea, which I did, then bring me back to teach history, and I'll retire. I'll put my papers in and retire. So it saved them having to call me out. You know, they didn't have to make a decision to get rid of me. I just made a deal with them. I said, let me come back, teach history, and then I'll put my papers in and retire.
Why did you choose history? I mean, obviously it seems that you made the choice of subject rather than having it chosen for you.
Oh, I really enjoy military history. I'm an avid reader, and I enjoy teaching it. And then the guy that was my instructor in history department at Fort Leavenworth when I went through the staff college was the head of the department back in the when he was my instructor in the 1980s. And so I asked him, I said, would you mind having me come back? Well, we got along well. He was the department head, so he made a deal to take me back in the history department when I came back. I had an advanced degree in history. My master's was history. And so I came back and taught history for 3 years.
So before we get too deep into the interview, tell me, what is the difference between the Staff College and the War College besides simply their locations?
The Staff College is designed mainly to educate mid-grade officers with about 10 years of service. They go there to become division staff officers and battalion commanders. The War College is for senior officers to go to become strategic level staff members at higher echelons and brigade and division commanders.
When you're in the military and you're an officer, do you pick a career path? In other words, you decide, well, one guy decides, I want to be a general, I want to command officers in the field, and another guy's like, well, I want to be an adjutant, I want to be a colonel, I want to do somebody's paperwork. I mean, is that how it works? Or
generally, it can work that way, but that's not the way the Army tells you it works, but yes, that's the way it generally works in real life. Most officers in the maneuver branches, the combat arms, aspire to lead other soldiers in combat arms units. And if you don't make that cut, if you don't get to do that, then your career is really stymied and you're not going to go any further. You may become a high-level staff officer somewhere, but that's about it. And so when I did not get selected because I didn't go to Desert Storm, all the guys in my year group that went to Desert Storm, almost all of them that were in my shoes got to be commanders because they had the experience. And that's what they evaluate. You know, it's not just your reports, it's what jobs you have. And so they had the experience, they got picked, and it's just the way it works. Had I stayed in, I might have stayed a lieutenant colonel until they made me retire at 26 years. There's a low possibility of making full colonel, but if you don't command in the infantry, at least, in the infantry branch. Some of the other branches you can make colonel because every branch is different. You can make colonel a lot easier in some of the support arms branches not having commanded. But as an infantryman, if you don't command an infantry unit, you generally do not get promoted.
what is the real difference between a lieutenant colonel and a colonel in the military on a practical level?
Well, they get paid more and they get to command higher level units. They command brigades. A brigade's probably 3,500 to 4,000 soldiers. A infantry lieutenant colonel commands one battalion, and a brigade will probably have 5, maybe 6 battalions in that brigade. So as a lieutenant colonel, you can command the battalion, which depends on the type of unit it is, anywhere from 650 to 1,000 soldiers maybe, depending on the type of unit.
And part of the reason I'm asking you these questions is we have a lot of listeners who are interested in things pertaining to the military, but they really don't understand how it works. And so it kind of gives us an opportunity to kind of...
Oh, sure. I understand. I go out and give talks to civic units a lot, and a lot of them have no military experience because they came in way after the draft, and so they don't understand how it works. And to them, a sergeant major outranks a major, but they don't know that a sergeant major is an enlisted rank and a major is commission rank. They're completely different, but they just figure the sergeant major sounds like it's a higher rank.
Do you remember that? Do you remember that scene from the movie Good Morning Vietnam? And the sergeant major looks at Robin Williams. He says, he points to the stripes on his arm. He says, 3 up, 3 down. Does that mean anything to you, Airman? And Robin Williams goes, the end of an inning.
Yeah, I remember that. That's a lot of the people I deal with. They don't have any background, so they don't understand. That's funny. Yeah, that's exactly right.
So you have a tremendous interest in history. Did that interest begin in the military when you were at the college, or was that something that you took into the military?
Oh, no, my dad loved military history. He had military history books on his bookshelves at home and was an avid reader, and he got me interested just because it rubbed off on me. He loved military history. He loved to read. So when I looked at his bookshelf, I got interested in his books and started reading. We lived in Germany back in the 1960s. This is before they had a lot of TV that you could watch. And so I became an avid reader, and the library wasn't too far from where we lived in Berlin. And so I'd go to the American Library there and check out military history books. The 900 section was my favorite. So I'd go through the stacks and just pick books out and read.
So when you say there wasn't a lot of television in Germany, was that because they still hadn't rebuilt from the war, or was it just that all the television was in German and there wasn't?
Well, they had one American. Yeah, we weren't very good German speakers, and they were German channels, but there was only one American channel, and it was only on part of the day in the 1960s, Armed Forces Network, and so it was very limited what we had on TV to watch. One station, and it was on part of the day, and so TV wasn't a big thing for us. We did a lot of reading and other stuff, lots of sports.
Did they show Hogan's Heroes on the English television station?
No, it's not because they couldn't do it. It's just because the station had a set broadcasting, and they didn't have a lot of entertainment. It was mainly news and stuff like that, specials, but documentaries. No, that's funny because I actually remember Hogan's Heroes, but no, they didn't show it on AFN at that time.
Okay. When I was in high school, we had an exchange student from Germany. And he and I are still friends today. In fact, I interviewed him here on this program about, I guess, 2 months ago now. And he's living in Germany now with his family and everything. And his son is actually serving at Fort Lejeune right now.
Oh my golly!
I guess whatever arrangements there are between Germany and the United States military, his son is German born and is a German citizen, but he's serving in the Marine Corps at Fort Lejeune right now.
Wow.
So I saw him and his wife here, I guess, about a year ago when they came to visit him. But when we were in high school, I told him, I said, the funniest show on TV is Hogan's Heroes. I'm trying to get a reaction out of him.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to see what he would say. And he told me, he said, I know that show. He said, we watch it in Germany. He said, it's not as funny in English.
That's good.
The dialogue was dubbed in German.
Yeah.
In the German version, Colonel Klink had a girlfriend that you never saw on camera, but she was referred to, and there were just all kinds of things. So the dialogue in the German version was totally different from what we were watching English, which was the actual dialogue.
Yeah, that's funny.
But apparently that was a hit show there in German. But so you were in Germany, and when you were going to the 900 section of the library, was there any particular period of history that attracted you, or were you just sort of soaking them all in at that time?
Like reading all periods, but I really focused on World War II because we were in Berlin, and I was fascinated. This is, just 20 years after the war ended. I was fascinated reading about what happened to Germany during the war, so I really read a lot about World War II, but I read all different periods. It was just that we were in Germany. I took advantage of that. I remember John Toland's book, The Last Battle, came out when we were living in Berlin. I think it was in '66, and I was fascinated by that book because the book was so timely. The people that he interviewed were still living at that time. They lived in Berlin, and all the places he talked about in West Berlin, I could actually go to and visit. Places in East Berlin were off limits, of course, but that was the one book that really made an impression on me.
And I did not intend for this interview to go in this direction, but
I'll talk about anything.
Since you were living in Germany at this time and studying World War II, and you're a lot closer to it than I ever was or could have been, but as I study World War II, I am convinced that Joseph Stalin was a bigger butcher than Adolf Hitler ever was.
Absolutely.
And
the problem is we didn't beat them in the war, so the records were all hidden. Of course, when the wall fell and the Soviet Union fell, they opened the records for a few years, then closed them because they were finding out so many bad things when researchers went to Russia. But that guy killed more people than Hitler ever dreamed of.
I find it impossible to have any respect for the people who are supposed to be my heroes. And by that I mean men like FDR, men like Winston Churchill. How could they have allied themselves with Joseph Stalin? I mean, had they allied themselves with Satan himself, I would have had more respect for them.
Yeah, it's incredible, because we opened the door for the Cold War when we did that by allowing the Soviets to become so strong. We made them what they were.
Because as I read MacArthur's reminiscences, I very much gained the impression that, and I read Patton's memoirs, and I gained the impression that, and they were, two of the ranking commanders for the United States at that time, that they also lost respect for their leaders.
Yeah.
Because of the way World War II played out.
Absolutely.
More so than MacArthur.
I don't think they had any tolerance for politicians. They were very realistic in their approach to how things were, and they were not tolerant of politicians who made deals with, like you said, the devil.
By the time you were there in the 60s, had the Germans recovered? Of course, obviously, the East Germans had not recovered from the Soviets.
No, and that was very interesting. If you went to East Berlin, it looked like it had just come out of 1945. It was a Potemkin village. They had the main street was lined with nice buildings, and everything behind it was rotted, shell holes in buildings, tin roofs. It was awful. It was terrible. And when East Germany fell, the West Germans have spent billions trying to restore that country because it was so far behind. But West Germany had recovered. It was incredible. In 20 years, it was incredible how much they had done. And, of course, we helped them with the Marshall Plan.
Right.
It was like the war never occurred in West Berlin. You see the pictures of the end of the war. The buildings are all of them are burned out. And in 1965, 66, it was like the war had never occurred. I mean, it was beautiful. It was a great place to live.
So how many years then did you live in Germany?
All total, about on three different occasions.
You said it was 1971 when you enlisted in the military.
Yes, sir.
Where were you living at that time?
My dad was stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia, and he took me down to the recruiting station in Columbus, signed me up right there when he came back from Vietnam.
I want to ask you about that trip to the recruiting station, but before we talk about that, let's have a brief word from our sponsor, the Barnes Review. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Back with our guest, Lieutenant Colonel Ed Kennedy.
Your dad had just come back from Vietnam. When you asked him, you said, okay, Dad, I want you to sign these papers so that I can go into the military. And he's just come back from Vietnam. Was he enthusiastic to sign those papers, or did he try to talk you out of it?
I don't think he was enthusiastic, but he never tried to talk me out of it. He said, that's really what you want to do. He was a big believer in being patriotic and doing your duty. He served in World War II as an enlisted sailor before he got out of the Navy and went to West Point and became an infantry officer, and then he served in Korea and went on to Vietnam as an infantryman. But he was a big-time believer in being patriotic and serving your country. So he didn't try to talk me out of it. He said, he did talk a few times about me becoming a dentist. He said they make lots of money and I could retire early.
So he's
talking about himself retiring.
About war to dissuade you from wanting to go.
Oh no.
As you studied military history, at some point you gained a interest in the war between the states. How did that happen?
Well, I taught the main course at Fort Leavenworth at the Command and General Staff College. We had a core curriculum course. We taught the war, and I also taught the elective that we used, which was called Chickamauga Staff Ride, and it was very, very popular back then. It went for about 20 years as one of the most popular electives at Fort Leavenworth. When 9/11 happened, it kind of fell off the map because of the cost and because the students were more interested in taking electives that would help them if they went to Afghanistan and Iraq. But the elective that I taught was a 9-week-long elective. It was an excellent elective, but it was very compressed. And then the 9th week, we took the students for an entire week and studied the Chickamauga campaign, which began in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and then we drove the routes that the Union Army took to get to the battlefield in the last 2 days because it was a 2-day battle. We spent 2 days on the battlefield. I also took students to Vicksburg. We'd spend 3 days at Vicksburg with the students at what's called SAMS, which is the second-year course for selected officers. They go on to become high-level staff planners. And so we take them to Vicksburg as well, which was a lot of fun. And I still take groups to both those battlefields. Last year I took the commandant of the Army Engineer School and his staff to Vicksburg. We spent several days there studying the campaign.
So I'm going to ask you an irrelevant question that just popped into my mind, based on the fact that you've spent time not just teaching these battles, but actually spending days at a time on the battlefield with the students. When I was in high school, we played a game called Diplomacy. Are you familiar with it? It's a board game.
No, sir, I'm not.
And it's a board game, and basically with this board game, you can recreate any war or battle that ever took place in Europe at any time in history. And one of the things that we discovered playing this board game, and each game would take days, sometimes weeks to play. Not in 24-hour periods, obviously, but, we'd play about 2 hours a day for, 2 and 3 days a week for however long it took to play out a game. And then we'd start another one. And it was actually a club that we had there at the school. We called it the Diplomacy Club. One of the things that I discovered playing Diplomacy was that it did not matter how you stacked the resources. In other words, you could give one army more soldiers than it should have had, or you could have given it a slightly bigger navy, or you could have given it a little bit more artillery. It really didn't matter at the end of the war. All of the wars of European history pretty much turned out the same every time, and it was because of the geography. And so, was the geography in the war between the states, the geography of these battlefields such? Do you believe that if we were to fight those same battles 10 times, that at least 9 of the 10 times the outcomes would have been the same?
Oh, wow. That's a hard one. It's a human endeavor, and it depends on, how people at that particular time react to the stimuli. It's like at the Battle of Chickamauga. There's a 50-50 chance the Union could have won that battle, but the commander made a tremendous blunder. And why did he make it? He was probably exhausted. He had sleep deficient. He had been deprived of good rest, and he made a bad decision that on another day he might not have made, and they might have won. Who knows?
But so when you were a student at the college teaching, at some point in that you became interested in the war between the states.
Well, I'd actually been interested since a kid because my dad had told me we had family members that served in the Confederate Army, and one of my goals starting back in the mid-'90s was to join the Sons of Confederate Veterans. I wanted to find my ancestors, so I started doing genealogy work with my father. And we never had names. We didn't know who they were. We just knew from family lore that we had Confederate ancestors. And one of the stories my grandfather had told for years is that his grandfather had been a Confederate soldier. And he said his leg had been shot off by a cannon in the war. And so when I did all the research on it, there were no records of his leg ever being shot off. But he had been a Confederate soldier. He had diabetes that had been cut off before my grandfather was born. And so, it was the story he told the kid. And I laugh now because my grandfather went to his grave thinking his grandfather had his leg shot off by a cannon. And we know now it was diabetes. But he told my great aunt that, and they both repeated that story numerous times. But when I went to the pension records in Mississippi, there was no record of him losing his leg. He had been shot in the foot, but he had never lost his leg during the war. I always kind of laugh. My grandfather believed that as a kid, and my grandfather never told him the truth.
Well, my grandfather was one of 9 children. All of the boys in his family were over 6 foot tall, and he was about 5 foot tall.
Normal size, like me.
Not like 5'8", 5'9", 5'11". He was like 5 foot.
Wow, that's very unusual.
I'm 6'2". My dad was 6'1". Tallness runs in the family, but my grandfather wasn't tall. And I asked him when I was a kid why he was so much shorter than his brothers, than my great uncles. And he told me it was because when he was a kid, he was the youngest child. And so he had to sleep. He had to live. He got the bedroom that was in the back of the house. And that room only had a 4-foot ceiling. And I was probably in high school before I realized that wasn't the reason he was short.
You gotta love them. That's funny.
So you found your Confederate ancestor. Were you still active in the military, or were you?
Oh yes, yeah. I was teaching history at the Army Staff College when I started digging these guys out. And after I found one, we started finding more. And they just started pouring out of the woodwork. So it was fascinating. I had a direct tie to the Battle of Chickamauga where I was taking the students because James L. Kennedy, who was my great-great-grandfather, actually was a company commander in Claiborne's division at Chickamauga. So I had a personal tie to what I was teaching. It's just kind of a neat tie.
And so you're active now in the Sons of Confederate Veterans?
Yes, sir.
And are you an officer in your camp there in Georgia, or was it Alabama?
It's in Alabama. I'm the lieutenant commander, which I'm the assistant flunky.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm active in our camp.
And I know you told me that your job now, if it's a volunteer position, now that you're kind of forced into retirement, and we'll get into that conversation here in a minute, but that your job now is working with the Vietnam Memorial?
Yeah, we have a 50-year commemoration program that started 6 years ago, and every year we have a big program here. very, very big deal. And this year, it's going to be 4 days long. We have the Wall That Heals, the traveling wall, will be coming here. And they're bringing a new one this year. This is the one that's twice as big as the old one, and you can actually do the etchings off this wall, which is kind of neat. So we have a 4-day program, and I always set up displays and talk to people in the public, because the first 2 days, which are a Thursday and Friday, will have seniors from almost all of the high schools in North Alabama will be coming over, and they're going to not only see the wall, but we have a large building, the JC building here in Huntsville, Alabama, that we will set up military exhibits and displays and then talk to the students.
Did you ever see the Confederate Wall, the traveling Confederate Wall?
No, sir. Did not even know there was one.
I was a board member, what we call the Florida Traveling Wall Society, and the gentleman who gave the inspiration to build it had actually saw the Vietnam traveling wall, and he so forth. And basically what we did was we duplicated that traveling wall with the names of Confederate veterans that had either served in Florida or from Florida. And, you know, we took it to reenactments and things.
Wow. I didn't even know there was one.
Yeah, it just became a project that financially it was hard to sustain. We were able to build a wall, and we were able to travel with it some, but it became hard to sustain. And the SCV here in Florida basically took ownership of the wall, and we shut down our nonprofit that we had going, and we gave the wall to the SCV. And there's a camp in Tampa that still travels with it a few times a year. But I'm mentioning all that to say that I know what a financial undertaking it is, you know, to move that wall around and, you know, to do what you're doing. I mean, I know what a massive undertaking it is, not just in time and energy, but also in money and raising that money. And it's
fortunately, they have lots of corporate sponsors here in Huntsville because it's a high-tech city. They have a lot of aerospace corporations here, and they're very supportive.
So, you know, we didn't have that kind of support with a Confederate memorial.
Right. It's not politically correct.
So we were raising money from a lot smaller sponsors, but people don't have an idea when they go and visit something like that what it took even to get it there or to have it there for them.
No, they don't, unfortunately.
So you began to dig out your Confederate ancestors while you were teaching history.
Yes, sir.
How did that change the way you were teaching the history, or did it?
Well, it didn't. I've always, my dad was very proud of being a Southerner, very proud of being from Mississippi. My mother was from South Carolina. You know, they brought us up in a Southern home. I mean, everything was traditionally Southern. You know, for years, I never understood why we called my sister. But that's just a Southern thing, and we call each other by our middle names, not our first names. That's a Southern thing. My Yankee friends don't understand that. But, you know, we ate grits. Fried chicken was a staple on the dinner table at night. You know, when we had supper 3 times a week, it was fried chicken. I mean, it was just the way we did things. And now I look back, I go, gosh, that is so Southern, the way we were brought up.
My brother-in-law, born and raised, still lives in Maryland, and he comes down here. He gets grits and he gets fried chicken, but he doesn't understand why we eat them together. In his mind, grits are a breakfast food, fried chicken is a dinner food.
Yeah, that's the best of all worlds.
So I go to Bojangles, and I like to get grits as my side instead of the potatoes.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you were discovering your Confederate ancestors and joining the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and becoming more and more involved in your Confederate heritage and promoting it, I'm guessing that your promotion of it was more outside of the classroom and outside of the staff college than within it?
It was. I didn't force it down anybody's throat, but I did, you know, in history class, you know, I made sure that we gave the Southern perspective. It wasn't the victors write the history, and I tell you, the stuff that's being taught is very pro-Northern. It gives short shrift to the Southerners, and there's a lot of bias and bigotry. You know, there's a lot of stereotyping that all Southerners are racist, and that, you know, it gets very, very tiring of hearing this stuff, especially from people who have never lived in the South and don't know anything about it. but it's the typical stereotypical bigotry that you run into, that we're all stupid rednecks. I have to laugh. In 2005, I was invited by the Leavenworth County Library Association. They found my name online in our website. I was invited to go debate the head of the NAACP from St. Louis, Missouri, about the battle flag. I creamed this guy in the debate. The guy showed up. He was not prepared. And I personally think, based on his actions and what he said, he thought he was going to be debating some hit that fell off the back of the sugar beet wagon. I got there, and I'd already rehearsed my opening statements because you only had so much time to make them. And I read mine, and he had no written notes. He was writing on a napkin as I was speaking. He gave an absolutely terrible talk. I won the debate, but, it's just fascinating. They stereotype you as an ignoramus, because you support the Confederacy or, the Southern way of life, and they know nothing about it.
Well, I'm going to tell a story here, and I'm probably going to tell it maybe not quite right because it's a story that was told to me over a decade ago, and obviously it's a story that I'm telling secondhand. But the gist of the story is that Jeb Stuart IV, and did you ever meet Jeb Stuart IV?
No, sir. I know who he is, but I've never met him personally.
Okay. Jeb Stuart IV, his grandfather was a
Yes, sir.
commander, and Jeb Stuart IV was a cavalry commander, although cavalry had changed from horses to tanks.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But Jeb Stuart IV, he told me the story that when he went into the military, that he went through the ranks very quickly. That no sooner than he had gone in as a second lieutenant, that he was promoted to first lieutenant, and then he was promoted to captain, and then he was promoted to major, and he was promoted to lieutenant colonel, and he had only been in, he was still counting his enlistment in months, and he was promoted to full bird colonel. And he said that they were having a reception to celebrate his promotion. And he said at some point during the reception, he said one of the generals that was there basically told him, congratulated him on making full bird colonel. Stuart kind of made a comment that it was amazed at how quickly he had been going through the ranks, and basically this general told him, he said, Colonel Stuart, he said, you've risen through the ranks as quickly as you have because of your name.
Oh.
And then he told him, he said, and because of your name, you have risen as far as you will ever go in the Union Army.
Wow.
Yeah. And he did. He spent his entire career as a colonel. And, most of the time was spent arranging Civil War reenactments and things.
Wow. That's typical of their attitude.
Yeah, so because his grandfather had been General Jeb Stuart, they basically told him that he would never make the top ranks in the Army because of that. That was
it's amazing. For years people venerated the Confederates, even Northerners in the Army venerated the Confederates, and they were treated very well. And then this race thing has poisoned the well. And it has nothing to do with race, but they've made it into a race issue. I was talking to a good friend 2 weeks ago up the road here at the Nathan Forrest home. He just finished writing his second book on his black ancestor, who he's very proud of, was one of Nathan Forrest's slaves, and then became the orderly for Robert E. Lee.
So you have met Al Arnold, who is just a great guy, by the way.
Absolutely. He's a great friend. And so we were talking about that. So you know Al Arnold, but anyway, I sent you some pictures of the newsletter I just published for our camp last week. It's got his pictures in there, but we were talking about this. He's one of those guys that became a believer, when he found out his ancestor had served in the Confederate Army. So, it's amazing so many people are in denial. I recruited a black member in our Sons of Confederate Veteran camp in Leavenworth, Kansas. He's a retired federal deputy marshal. And people just couldn't believe it. But this guy is absolutely a hardcore Confederate. He loves his ancestor. We went and put a Confederate headstone on his grave in Arkansas.
Question real quick.
Sure.
In 2005, 2006, you were at the Staff College and you were in the SCV in Leavenworth, Kansas?
Yes, sir.
Because at that time, I was the division chaplain of the Kansas division. I was pastoring in Wichita. and
Oh, I didn't know that.
I spoke to all of the camps, and so I'm pretty sure I possibly met you at some point, and we just don't remember it.
We had to have. That's amazing.
And I would have been at the state convention, and Charles Walthall
Yes,
was the division.
absolutely, yeah. Yes, absolutely.
And so I'm sure we've met, we just don't remember it.
That's amazing. Absolutely, yeah. Charles moved. I think he's in Louisiana now.
Yeah, so I know that we've had to have met, but anyway, so you had recruited a black compatriot for the SCV camp in Leavenworth.
Oh yeah, he marched in the Veterans Day parade in his Confederate uniform. He had a lot of guts. His ringtone on his phone is Dixie. He's a great guy. He's the only black guy in Leavenworth, Kansas that drives around with a pickup truck with Confederate plates on it.
As you were beginning to become more involved in issues relating to your heritage, what is happening there at the college and with the Army command that is above you, that you're serving under?
I can tell you right now the hostility is palpable. In February of 2000, Colonel Jim Spiker, who lives just down the road from you, right outside of Tampa, and I put a black Confederate exhibit in the Army Staff College library entry. They had a big display case. And we put, for Black History Month, we said, why don't we put this up and see if we can get any interest in getting some blacks to join the SCV. So we put this display up, and a day later, one of the officers there complained about it immediately because he was black. Immediately, it was censored. They wrapped it. I've got pictures. I'll send you the pictures. They wrapped it in wrapping paper so no one could see it. This is incredible. This is at the Army Staff College. They call it the Intellectual Center of the U.S. Army. They wrapped the display so no one could see it. They went through a couple of weeks of, arguing about what are we going to do about it. In the meantime, it's covered up. They decided they would ban it. So they banned the display, said you can never put that back up. And, oh, by the way, anyone that wants to put a display up has to go through a process now to submit what they're going to put in it so it can be approved. In other words, the commissars, the political commissars there, had to put their approval on anything that gets displayed. So we were forced to take our display down, and they replaced it, and I'm not lying to you, they replaced it with a Barbie doll display at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. That's
whose idea was that?
We took photographs of the display. We took photographs. Jim Spiker took them with the wrapping paper around the display. And this is the kind of idiocy we're dealing with. But very hostile. Now the worst part's yet to come. The guy who was the head general there, the commandant, was a guy named William Steele. And you'll get the irony in this right here. William Steele went after Colonel Jim Spiker. And here's the irony. Both of them went to the Citadel. Both of them Citadel graduates. William Steele was incredibly politically correct. He still is. And he went after Jim Spiker, and he tried to take Jim Spiker's efficiency report, which had already been completed and filled out. There's an end date that it goes, and he tried to change the efficiency report to harm Jim Spiker for doing this, putting the display up. He couldn't get me because I'd been retired from the Army for 3 years when we did this, so I was out of his touch. But he went after Jim Spiker, tried to ruin him.
Did Jim have any consequence from that, or how did that work out for him?
Well, he decided to retire. He left that job, and he went to work for the FBI. But General Steele, was after him, and they held Colonel Spiker's efficiency report for about 8 months before they sent it in, which is against the regulations, trying to figure out how to affect his efficiency report to reflect that he's put this display up and caused such a stir. And of course, he had done nothing wrong. It had nothing to do with his job performance, but Steele wanted to come after it.
Right.
Steele is in South Carolina now, and he's trying desperately to get on the board of visitors for the Citadel. That's his alma mater. And I notified the SCV in South Carolina. I said, this guy's, he's a dangerous guy. He's not a pro Southern type of guy. This guy was going after Jim Spiker for putting up a historical display because one guy complained about it.
I'm going to ask you about some of the other problems that you've run into, but before we do that, let's have a brief word from our sponsor, the American Free Press.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed, and that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
What other problems did you run into?
Well, I had my truck was vandalized. I mean, I had a SCV sticker. People rip it off, then my license tags, just high school type stuff. But it was officers. It was somebody at the staff college.
Done by military personnel.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You would assume that there would be a severe punishment for military personnel engaging in such activity, especially when the property that they are vandalizing belongs to an officer.
No punishments?
Well, the problem is, even if we caught them, they might not have done anything to them just because of political correctness. But, I mean, these guys never got caught. We don't know who did it, but it's pretty obvious. It was in the faculty parking lot, and the only people with access to it, are the faculty and the students right there.
So is there anything else that's happened? And before we start talking about you're actually being asked to retire, is there anything?
Oh, yeah. When I left the Army, I got a job teaching high school ROTC. I went back to Leavenworth, Kansas, and ran the high school program for almost 7 years. And I asked if one of the young men there that was at the high school was called into the principal's office and was abused, verbally abused and threatened because he had a Dixie Outfitter T-shirt on with a bird dog on it and some ducks and, a little Confederate flag on it. He was absolutely abused and told, they were going to kick him out of school if he didn't turn his T-shirt inside out. The kid was almost in tears. And they were ugly about it. So I went to the principal to kind of advocate for this kid, because I said, this is a good kid. He's never done anything wrong. He's a good student. And they accused him of being a racist. Well, he had black friends. I said, this kid's not a racist. But this is typical of people who aren't from the South. They assume that if you have a Confederate flag, you're a racist. So anyway, the principal, kind of blew me off, and they treated this kid poorly. His dad was in the Army, and they moved. Otherwise, they were going to file a lawsuit. Well, the next year, my kid got a Dixie Outfitter T-shirt for Christmas. He said, Dad, am I going to be treated the same way if I wear my T-shirt to school? So I went to the principal. Now, I worked for the principal running the ROTC department. But I went to him after school on my time, not on official duty time. I said, look, as a parent, I want to know, is my kid going to get abused if he wears this Dixie Outfitter T-shirt? And the principal went ballistic on me. I said, well, I guess that answers the question. I told my kid he's going to go ballistic. So I got hold of an organization. I don't know if you're familiar with Rutherford Institute.
Yes, sir.
And they sponsored a lawsuit. We went after them because what happened is the principal tried to fire me for just asking if my kid could wear the T-shirt.
Wow.
He tried to fire me illegally. They were so dumb. And it's always kind of fun, beating people that are dumb like this in court. And so this thing went to federal district court. Their school lawyer there was not a very bright guy. He advised him, yeah, go after this guy Kennedy. We can get him. When I got Rutherford, we got a four-name legal firm from Kansas City. And when the school district saw that we had a four-name legal firm, they said, uh-oh. So they went and got a four-name legal firm, and immediately that firm told them, you better settle quickly because you're going to lose everything. And if you lose, you will lose your insurance. So the school came to us and said, we want to settle out of court, which means we won. My kid got to wear his T-shirt, and I retained my job. But it was a very ugly situation. It was a hostile work environment after that. I looked for another job. I said, I'm walking down the hall looking over my shoulder every day because every time I did something, there was somebody I felt like was going to try to get me. So I went back to the Army in 2004 to teach at the Staff College.
What happened when you went back to the Staff College? Obviously, at some point between when you went back and when you were forced to retire, So what had happened in that period of time?
Well, I got 13 years of the highest rating you can get on your annual report is an excellent. I got 13 years of excellence. But I got a new boss a couple of years ago where I work here at Redstone Arsenal because I transferred to the campus down here. And the new boss called me in, and I sent you the information about the forest picture, set up historical displays that went with my leadership instruction, and we were studying the movie 12 O'Clock High. That's what we use in our leadership class. And we talk about, in the movie, Gregory Peck plays General Savage. And so I said, this is a great way to tie Chickamauga, our staff ride that we do separately, to this leadership instruction. I said, here's the tie. And I put the picture in the display of the first 8th Air Force general, because General Savage in the movie 12 O'Clock High is 8th Air Force. He's a brigadier general. The first general killed in Europe was a brigadier general. It happens his name is Nathan Bedford Forrest III. And that caused me to get a formal complaint filed on me. And then I was formally counseled. I got a copy of the counseling sitting right here. I was told it was insensitive to blacks to put that in there. I said, it's a historical fact. What is insensitive about a historical fact? I said, this is the grandson of General Forrest who fought in the war. I said, what's the problem? But you can see the ignorance that they have. They went after me, and I got a formal counseling. And then when I rebutted it, because by regulation you can rebut it to put it in your file so that it's not sitting there, like you did something wrong and admitted to it, I put in a rebuttal. Well, instead of treating it as a rebuttal, my new boss treated it as an appeal, and he sent it up to Fort Leavenworth. So he publicized it to the whole Staff College chain of command. So I now have a target on my back. And when I came up for my contract renewal, because I'm Title 10, I'm a government employee, but I'm Title 10, that means that they can pull the rug on you anytime they don't want you anymore with no reason given. I had a target on my back. When I applied for my next renewal, normally you get a 2 to 3 year renewal. You can get up to 5 if you're really super good. So I put in for a renewal, and they said, we're only giving you a 1, which is like probation. And I asked them why, and they said, you have been proselytizing. I said, proselytizing what? And they wouldn't tell me. So I said, well, this is pretty outrageous. How do I fix what I don't know is broken? So I went to my fellow faculty, and I said, I need you to write a statement saying that I'm not proselytizing. So I got several of my friends on faculty to write formal letters certifying that I've never proselytized on duty for anything. Last year, they came back and said, we're not renewing your contract. I asked them why, and the head of the leadership department, Ted Thomas, who was my boss up at Fort Leavenworth, said, we don't have to tell you. I said, oh, that's interesting. This is the leadership department, and you're not going to tell me why you're firing me. And they said, we're not firing you. I said, that's a euphemism because you're not renewing my contract. I'm out of work. I said, you're going to replace me with somebody else. The job didn't go away. So they said, we don't have to tell you. I said, I know why. Somebody filed a complaint on my Robert E. Lee mug. I had a Robert E. Lee mug with little Confederate flags in my office. So somebody, and I'm suspecting it might be the same guy that filed the complaint about the Nathan Forrest III's photograph of him in his Army Air Corps uniform in that 8th Air Force display. But I don't know because they won't say.
When did that happen? When was your last day actually with?
Well, I was told this on September the 15th last year. I requested a 6-month extension to look for work. So my last day was 28 February. That's when my contract expired, and I was without work on the 28th of February. And the interesting thing is we have written formal policies at the college, which is recognized as an accredited educational institution by the Northwest Association of Schools and Colleges. We have a formal policy there of academic freedom. Because it's part of an accredited university, you have to have academic freedom. So we say we have it, but because I had that picture of Nathan Bedford Forrest III, an Army Air Corps general who died, first one to die in Europe during World War II, leading a bomber group over Germany, because I had that photograph in the display, my boss said was not okay, and I had to take it out. So I took the display down, never put it back up. You know, I'm at the age now that I don't have a lot of hard skills I can sell. No one wants an infantry officer that goes out and kills people and blows things up. But I've worked in academia so long now, I figured that's something I can do, and I enjoy doing it.
I'm going to ask you a question that's going to seem silly, but a Robert E. Lee coffee mug, a Confederate battle flag, and I've seen the picture, and we're talking the little desk flags. We're talking the little 2
yes, sir.
3-inch flag.
Right, exactly.
Little stick that was inside a coffee mug. I've seen a picture of it. But a Confederate flag, a Robert E. Lee coffee mug, a picture of, had it been Nathan Bedford Forrest Sr. and not Nathan Bedford Forrest III, and you're a professor of military history, would these not be military history artifacts, and would it not be normal for a professor of military history to have such artifacts in his office?
You know, that makes perfect sense to you and me. It obviously did not make any sense to them. It made no sense to them whatsoever.
And even if you had a picture of Adolf Hitler in your office.
It's funny you say that because I have a history. I have a history buddy.
Was that
I have a
military artifact?
It makes perfect sense to you and me, but we're dealing with people that have a total void of common sense. They're totally ignorant. They judge things on emotion, not on logic and facts.
And these are the people who are fighting our wars, these people totally devoid of common sense. And we wonder why the world is in the horrible mess that it's in today. Anyways, that's all the time that we have today for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. I'm so glad that you could join us, that once again you could be our guest, that you could be part of our listening audience. And I hope that you'll come back next week and listen again. We're going to have another great show for you. Check out my website, www.dixieheritage.net. You can get a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. And you can know the truth even if the U.S. Army doesn't want to read it. You can read it absolutely free of charge. And when you do sign up for that free book, we'll also send you a free copy of my weekly Dixie Heritage newsletter, no cost, no obligation. So once again, on behalf of all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, God bless. See you next week.